tonight. He always jumps in about that. This is our concluding program for this year, this academic year, but it's one that I always love because we get to hear from the people who've gone out on these regional security studies trips through the Air War College, seeing firsthand what's going on in the regions, gotten a chance to talk to some of the principals out in that area, and so. I always love when the scouts come home and report in, and a good intelligence briefing for all of us. I appreciate everybody coming out. Looking forward, we're now, I know for the last couple of years with pandemic and other things, we've been a little bit ad hoc. We're going to get ahead of the game and publish a program for the coming year here over the summer, so stand by for that. Right now, it's still looking pretty good for Ambassador Fiona Hill to join us in the fall, which would be our kind of our highlight program. So stand by for more on that. But tonight, what we're so fortunate to have is, as I said again, a group of both faculty and students from the Air War College who've been out on the regional security studies trips. And I'm going to turn this over at this point to the Dean of the Air War College. But first I have to preface this. Sometimes, I'm a fighter guy, he's a fighter guy. Sometimes fighter guys, you come up, you say, how did they come up with that call sign? We've all got a call sign, nom de guerre. Mine's Waldo, Walter, Waldo. Okay, got it. But sometimes you're trying to figure it out. He's a pretty obvious one. His last name is Bottomley. His call sign is Rock. Colonel Bottomley.
Fortunately for you all, just like the call sign is, when you get to me, you have to hit rock bottom. So I apologize for that. I will tell you, for you, those of you in the audience, we've been asked, all of our speakers tonight have been asked to really project into the microphone. So if it sounds like we're yelling at you in the front row, we're doing that intentionally. Is that right, Jeremy?
Good.
Perfect.
Yes, thank you.
So again, thank you all for having us today. I think this is an annual event where you have in the regional security studies trips. We bring in a sample of 3 of those trips this year. I think you also have heard from a couple of our speakers earlier. I know Dr. Margaret Sankey has come and talked to the group about her book. And then we also have some returning visitors with you as well tonight. That's, again, a reiteration of our mission at the Air War College. We are there to educate military and civilian leaders as critical and strategic thinkers, and they're focused on being air-minded national security leaders is what our overall goal is. For this program, we'll get into the program of what our regional security studies program is about, but let me introduce each of the speakers that we're going to have tonight. We can just get a quick wave of hands. So again, I'm the moderator for you. We're going to bring in 3 different trips tonight. And normally, I think in the past, we've only brought in the instructor. But this year, we decided to bring in the instructor and also one of the primary students. And I'll call it the lead student or the best student, but we don't want the students to get their a little bit of an over-ego. They are graduating, by the way, this next Thursday. So we're excited for that for them. And so for our Baltic Sea trip is Dr. Mark Conversino, who is the Air University Chief Academic Officer and Provost. And then the student that Mark chose is Mr. Mark Turner, who's a Foreign Service Officer from the Department of State. And then the East Africa trip is Dr. Ashley Townsend. And Ashley is the course director for our Great Power Studies course at the Air War College. And the student that Ashley chose is Lieutenant Colonel Adrian Kettleson, who's a flight nurse in the Air Force. And then finally, the last trip that you'll hear from tonight is the South Asia trip, which is Dr. Margaret Sankey, and she's the Air University Research Coordinator of Sponsored Programs. And the student that she brought is, again, somebody with a call sign. So Lieutenant Colonel Billy Dice Yoakley, and he's a fighter pilot in the Air Force. And so I appreciate you all having us as part of the group. If you go to the next slide there, Jeremy. So this slide depicts, as we build, There you go. This slide depicts the locations that we traveled to. And so we had 19 trips that took 215 students and 50 faculty to 31 different countries. You'll see the slide, the folks that are speaking to us tonight are highlighted in different colors. So India, Philippines is the Asia trip. Europe is to Finland and Estonia, and the Africa trip went to Tanzania and the DRC. Something I wanted to point out, besides the other countries that we have, is the international fellows. So as you know, we have 47, we have a group of international fellows, international students that come from all over the world. This year, we have 47 from 47 different countries. And the international fellows, instead of traveling around the world, they travel here in the United States. And so we took those students this year, we've split them into two different groups, and they traveled to Boston and Boise, and Los Angeles was the first group. And you can see with the other group to Denver, Seattle, and Las Vegas. And so while our American students are learning all about the political, military, economic, and cultural aspects of international programs and international countries, then our international students are learning about those same things by visiting different cities, major cities inside the United States. We try to vary that from West Coast to East Coast, and also by large city and smaller city. A couple of the other things this year with our regional security studies program, we really tried to start to emphasize Asia, because you know that's a major issue for the United States. We're looking at the pacing threat, China and Asia, and also as we look across the world, we looked at how China was having an influence across the world. So even in the trips that travel to South America, for example, or the trips that travel to Africa or to the Middle East, we looked at China's influence in those areas, because we know that great power competition, if you call it that, between the powers, the United States, Russia, China, those are happening all over the world, not just in Asia, not just in Eastern Europe. And so I tell you what I will do is I would love to leave the podium and pass it on so that you could actually hear about each one of these trips. So what we're going to do is I think the plan is for each one of our instructors to come up and speak to you for a few minutes, and then to pass the podium off to the students to talk about their impression of that trip. So let's start with Dr. Conversino talking about the Baltic Sea states.
Thank you, Dr. Bottomley. Again, ladies and gentlemen, I know you've heard from me before. I'm usually a very optimistic person. Given my worldview, the glass is half empty and there's a dead fly floating around in what's left. So if we could go to the next slide, please, Jeremy. This year, we returned actually for me to the Baltic region. And as you see here, we visited Finland, our newest ally, and Estonia. For many Americans, the Baltic region for years was a place you went on a cruise ship. Now, because of the change in the geopolitical landscape, it is the most tense area in Europe because they all border the Russian Federation. And I'm going to share with you some observations on that, including some top-line lessons that we heard, and then turn over to my colleague from the State Department, Mr. Mark Turner. Next slide, please, Jeremy. So we've expanded NATO yet again. Finland is the 31st member. We had hoped to be the first U.S. delegation there upon their accession, but the Turkish and Hungarian governments felt otherwise and not approved them until after we left. So we would like to think it was our visit that pushed them across the line. Having said that, in Finland, we gained a valuable, very capable ally. But you'll notice on the chart here, I realize it's partially hidden by the view of the people off to the side, but it's meant to convey the challenge that we face. Following the end of the Cold War, NATO essentially disarmed. Now, we didn't have 600,000, 700,000, 800,000 Red Army troops and 30,000 tanks in the middle of Germany, but while we were expanding the alliance, shifting its focus to Afghanistan, we were disarming. To the point that today, the Secretary General of NATO celebrates the fact that now 7 of the 31 meet the 2% spending threshold. Only 7. At the same time, there are still NATO partners, despite all the promises of increased spending, they have to dig themselves out of a very deep hole. Many of them, the majority of them, cannot get a single brigade onto the field in less than a month. And even given a month, they may not be able to do that. And while the ground threat from Russia right now is not there for our allies because they're off fighting in Ukraine, they have a different sense of time than we do. And this is another takeaway, if you will, that this council is supposed to do in this class. We have to get outside our own arrogance and our own view of the world. When you can convince Finland and Sweden, that has been neutral for centuries, that the things in their region have changed so dramatically that their security now rests in belonging to NATO, you get a sense for how they view things living next door to the threat. The Estonian Chief of Defense said that Russia is, was, and will remain an existential threat to them. And one of the key takeaways I would present to you is in our discussions with them, they see how vital U.S. leadership is. NATO in a prolonged war will defeat Russia, assuming it doesn't go nuclear. But that's with the United States. Their concern is we want to get back to the Pacific. We want to get back to what Dr. Bottomley called China the pacing threat, and we'll leave them to their own devices. And along NATO's eastern flank, we had some very frank discussions about whether or not they believed Germany was actually going to fulfill that promise to spend $110 billion to build up their military. Poland is on track to have the largest army in Europe outside Turkey by the end of this decade, buying 1,300 tanks. They're prepared to defend themselves. The Finns never stopped conscription and spending despite the end of the Cold War. And even though they're now in the alliance, they reiterated the fact that they will defend themselves. And so at the Baltic Defense College, with a group of Baltic officers and a Polish colonel, we had this interesting discussion about the catch-22. They need and want U.S. leadership, but the feeling was as long as Uncle Sugar is willing to foot the bill and bring the muscle, there is no incentive for the other countries of Europe to step up to the plate and fulfill those requirements. So while it is a great thing to expand the alliance, their view is it doesn't matter if it takes Russia 2, 5, or 10 years to rebuild their military, they're not going anywhere. And we found that, I did, very enlightening. Next slide, please. Beyond that, I want to emphasize a couple points. As we've watched the war in Ukraine unfold over the last year, despite the Russian army's abysmal performance, they are burning through people, equipment, munitions at rates we realize now we cannot sustain. Our allies in the region, Estonia, prides itself on having provided the highest amount of aid to Ukraine on a per capita basis. But it may shock you to realize that the United States in a single year provided Ukraine $47 billion in military aid. That's $4 billion more than we spent every year in Afghanistan. Our total commitment is now over $100 billion. And many of our allies have now said, as much as we want to help, we're out. We are running out. I'll give you one quick statistic. In June of last year, at the height of the fighting, after we met at this meeting, the Ukrainians fired 210,000 artillery rounds in a month. The Russians fired 1.3 million. The United States produces 240,000 in a year. We focused on Russia's losses. The Ukrainians were losing 1,000 soldiers a day, every day in the fighting in June. So for our allies who live next door to Russia, this is not theoretical. And the other takeaway we got from the Estonian Chief of Defense was, thinking forward, liberation is not an option. They are not interested in allowing their countries to be used to absorb a future Russian assault while we get our act together, ride to the rescue, and defeat the Russians. Why is that? Next slide, please. Because of it, now these slides were meant to build. There's some pretty graphic photographs. As you know, Russia is waging a barbaric war against Ukraine. The damage that you see there exceeds by several times the entire Ukrainian economy at the start of this war. Estonia is a small country of 1.3 million people. They made a point of noting that the Russians could destroy all the infrastructure in their country without even crossing the border. So for them, liberation is not an option. It's, as the Estonian Assistant Minister of Defense said, we'd be holding a victory parade in the ruins of their country. So the challenge for them and for us is how do we build lasting security on NATO's eastern flank? Not for 5 years, not for 10 years, so that our son is pulled back into combat 10 years from now because we lack the strategic vision. I'll close this by pointing out, my view is our arrogance is what gets us into this. We can win battles. The American military has proven it will win battles and campaigns. But since 1945, we've also lost an awful lot of wars. And just the summer of 21, we lost a war to a medieval band of Taliban who were not receiving $47 billion in aid from a superpower. And so their message to us was, don't think of Russia, China, and all this separately. You've got to think of them as a single threat to the international order. And the subtext, of course, was, don't leave us hanging. I found this to be an extremely, of all the times that I've been there, I learned far more from their perspective this time than I ever have. And again, we bring that back as Americans with the understanding that when you have an entire ocean between you and the problem, things look very different. And so with that, let me turn over to our colleague from the State Department, Mr. Mark Turner.
Did I yell loud enough? Jeremy, could you hear me?
Very good, thanks.
Dr. Conversino and also Dr. Bottomley, appreciated the opportunity to go on the trip with the two of you. I want to talk very briefly. Oh, I'm sorry, if we can go to the next slide. So just a handful of photos I just wanted to throw out for the group. The first one is at the Finnish Air Force headquarters. Those are T-38s, 48s, trainers. Soon enough, they will be flying F-35s off of that same runway. The second photo is in the Baltic Sea as we were crossing from Helsinki to Tallinn. And I'll tell you, just to preview the geographic piece that I'm going to talk about in a minute, that's 52 miles. So it is closer from here to Auburn than it is from Helsinki to Tallinn, but only by about 2 miles. And then finally, the final photograph there is Russia in the background. That's us in the predominantly ethnic Russian city of Narva, Estonia, looking out at a very bleak Russia across the Narva River. So with that, I want to talk about really three things. One of them is the geography of this region. The second one is their will to defend. And then finally, is just simply the sort of history and the background between the Baltic states and Finland and Russia on the other side. So you can see there geographically, I am an Alabama boy. I'm Department of State, so I've been out of Alabama for about 16 years, but I'm from Huntsville. So I'm going to put this in geographic terms related to Alabama. First of all, 67.5 million square miles of the Baltics. That's about the size of Alabama and the Florida Panhandle. So again, it's not a large area. I already talked about the distance between the two capital cities that we visited. And then the other one is population. So with a little bit over 11 million people, Finland is slightly above population-wise the size of Alabama. And then all three Baltic nations combined are less than the population of the state of Tennessee. So you can see that we're not talking about a large geographic or population area when we refer to the Baltics here. Next slide, please. So you may or may not know who this individual is. He's a sniper from the Winter War in 1939-1940 between Finland and Russia, nicknamed the White Death. But I put this up here to illustrate what we just every single time we talk to anybody in either Finland or Estonia, we heard about the will to defend. And so what that looks like on paper is both Finland and Estonia do an annual survey of their populations to ask about literally their will to defend. And so in Finland, 83% of the country say that they would take up arms to defend Finland. In Estonia, it's 81% that think that Estonia should be defended. 66% say they would physically take up arms and defend their country. If you're curious rather, what the polling says in the United States, Quinnipiac University did a survey in March, right after the Ukraine invasion, and found that 55% of Americans said they would take up arms to defend the country, while 38% of Americans said they would flee. So that gives you an idea of what the differences are between Finland and the Baltics. Next slide, please. So it is indeed a rough neighborhood. And I put this photo up here because in 1989, they had what they call the Baltic Way. It was essentially a human chain stretching for about 400 miles from Estonia through Latvia and into Lithuania. And all of those flags that are up on the screen, those were illegal to possess in 1989, but people had them anyway and did it anyway. And this, really could be considered the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. As I'm sure everyone is aware, the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, and the three Baltic nations were, again, among the first to exit the Soviet Union, declared their independence, and they've been stalwart members of the European Union ever since. But the theme that we repeatedly heard again and again everywhere we visited was one that Dr. Conversino has already mentioned. It's you, and by you, they meant the United States, must be here now, immediately. You can't plan to come in because that's just not going to work. And so they have neither forgotten nor forgiven the occupation by the Soviet Union and by extension, the sort of new imperialist bent of new Russia. And it's again, a small area, small population, relatively small economies. They can't go it alone, but they really do look to the United States and the rest of their NATO allies to sort of be a pillar of assistance for them. So that concludes the Baltic piece of it, and I will turn it to me. Okay.
Yes, thank you. I'm Dr. Ashley Townsend. I'm going to talk to you about our trip to East Africa and the larger RSS program having to deal with Africa. And let me begin by saying, you may wonder in this new era of great power competition, when the U.S. government and the Department of Defense is increasingly focused on Russia and increasingly focused on China, why do we send RSS trips to Africa? The U.S. government doesn't seem to be particularly interested in what's going on in Africa. The Department of Defense is not particularly focused on what's going on in Africa, but they will be. And that's the reason why we do it. And I'll give you some context as to why I think that and why I think the Air War College invests in sending faculty and students to Africa on a regular basis. We weren't particularly worried about China investing in thinking about China and studying China 20 years ago. And now we are today. I think that we may have that same relationship with Africa 20 years from now. Africa, sub-Saharan Africa in particular, will have somewhere around 1 out of every 4 people on Earth by about 2050. 1 out of every 4 people on Earth will live in sub-Saharan Africa within the next 25 to 30 years. Africa is the last place on Earth that's going through a major population boom. The average age in the 2 countries that we went to in Congo is 13 years old. In Tanzania, it's a little bit older, it's 17. 10 out of the 15 largest cities on Earth will all be in sub-Saharan Africa by 2040, less than 20 years from now. 10 out of the 15 largest cities on Earth will all be, by population standards, in sub-Saharan Africa. Population boom in Africa is happening now. It's happening fast, and it's happening everywhere. It's an incredibly young place. And that's going to change a lot of population dynamics, economic dynamics, security dynamics throughout the continent. And the US as a global power is going to be drawn into that, and it's going to affect our security apparatus and our security thinking going forward. So why do we care about Africa? I think we care about Africa for a few reasons. Part is this population boom, but also part is the changing economy. Africa is chock full of the types of mineral resources necessary for electric batteries that are going to be in all the future cars and all the future battery operations. Cobalt, tin, copper, coltan, all these minerals are heavily found in Africa. And so that's increasingly becoming the reason why the US cares about it, why China's there, and why it's important to all of us. So on our trip, we went to Tanzania and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so here's a couple of pictures we're going to flow through here to show you kind of what we did on the trip and kind of how it fits with the larger concerns about Africa. So the class and the course is not just about Africa. We also talked intensively about great power competition in Africa. So what is China doing in Africa? What's Russia doing in Africa? For the most part, China's engaging in a couple different areas, but particularly focused on economic engagements, mineral extraction, mineral companies. They're getting all these precious minerals out of Africa and using them to grow the Chinese economy. In addition, they're building a lot of infrastructure, ports, railways, highways, transportation infrastructure, telecommunication infrastructure. China's heavily involved in that throughout the continent through some Belt and Road initiatives, through some other deals, but China's heavily involved in all of that. Russia, on the other hand, is not really heavily involved in the infrastructure, the economic side of Africa, but you have heard about the Wagner Group being involved in the Ukraine and fighting in Ukraine. Well, Wagner's real territory of operation prior to the Ukraine war was in Africa. And so there's about right now somewhere between 12 and 16 countries that Wagner's actively operating in Africa. They're still doing it today, even though they're operating in Ukraine. It's different forces now. The Wagner forces in Africa are largely Syrian now, as opposed to being Russian. They've taken a lot of their Russian elite troops out of Africa and are fighting in Ukraine, or probably not anymore fighting in Ukraine. And so the nature of who's fighting in Africa is a little bit different, but Wagner's still heavily involved there. And they're mostly providing security for unfriendly regimes to the US, heavily authoritarian regimes, the types of regimes that probably could not survive in their countries if it wasn't for Wagner protecting the regime itself. Most of these regimes would probably fall as a result of civil war type activity or of coups in their own country if it wasn't for Wagner troops there supporting their operations. So we can go to the next slide. Oh, we already did that. But so just to show you a couple of things we did, in addition to kind of the traditional military stuff, we visited national defense colleges in Congo and in Tanzania. We also visited some cultural sites like the Maasai village that's depicted here on the slide. So the trip was really designed around trying to get military engagements, talking to the Tanzanian military, talking to the Congolese military, learning what they were doing, learning why are you interacting with Africa, why are you interacting with China, why are you interacting with Russia, why do you think other African nations are doing this? And they told us quite a bit about that. I'd be happy to talk about that in the Q&A. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Additionally, we visited military hospitals. And the next slide, please. And then lastly, I'll say is we met with some very interesting private business owners in Congo and in Tanzania and learned from them the ways in which they think the great power competition is unfolding and why they choose to do business with China in some places that choose not to do business with the US. And it's often around the availability of Chinese corrupt practices that allow for the ease flow of money in which the US doesn't allow for that. So that's part of the reason why China tends to be on the economic side sometimes the preferred partner. However, on the security side, the US is still dominantly the preferred partner throughout the continent of Africa. I'd be happy to talk about that in the Q&A as well. So I'm going to turn it over now to the student. And thank you.
Down a little bit here. Can you see me back there? I think so. So first off, thank you for the opportunity, allowing us to be here with you today. It really is an honor. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience personally in Africa, talk about some of the events that we did that stood out to me, and then also talk about some of the lessons learned from that experience and what I'm going to take forward from that. So thank you, Dr. Townsend, for kind of laying the framework for our experience in Africa. I think that the coursework that was laid out for us before we did our travels was instrumental. It gave us that background of this is where Africa is, this is where Africa is going, but actually having the opportunity to go visit was like nothing I've ever experienced before. I think when you actually get the opportunity to see eyes on what you read, what you're taught in school, it's a whole nother level of learning. Can you hear me okay? I know it's kind of going like a little bit in and out. Now I could have done without the GI bug that I caught multiple times, but I guess that's part of the African experience. And I was warned beforehand that it was going to be an adventure. But I think, the fact that we went to the DRC and Tanzania, so two neighboring countries with just stark contrast between the two. I mean, drastic differences. I think that was just very eye-opening for me to see that neighboring countries could have just such different infrastructure, governmental processes, all those sorts of institutions. That was pretty incredible. Dr. Townsend talked a lot about the patronage system, big man politics, and how that can affect some of the countries within Africa. But to see it in person, walking around and having to go to pay somebody to use the restroom, to have to pay somebody to leave the airport in Kinshasa. I mean, this is the type of environment that the Congolese people have to operate in on the daily. And it's a very difficult and hard environment. And so I think experiencing that for myself gave a whole nother level of understanding and I think empathy for the Congolese people who, again, are dealing with this on the daily. And I know Dr. Townsend talked a little bit about the population within Africa. He warned us to just wait till you see Kinshasa. And the amount of youth and people just pouring out everywhere on the streets and then looking around and seeing that there is really no infrastructure to support these people. You kind of look at that and just wonder, how is this going to turn out? So I think there's a lot of questions for us as students as you saw that and you're wondering, and you can see these infrastructure challenges that we talk about within Africa, but then again, also looking forward to those challenges and what that's going to be for them. So a couple of, I think, engagements that we went on that stood out for me. One was that engagement with the community leaders that Dr. Townsend talked to. And I think that experience, just listening to those that are on the ground, trying to move things forward, trying to start businesses, trying to progress in certain ways, and just hearing the hurdles and the tribulations and that they're having to endure. Some of them kind of knowing that when it's election times that they're going to be taxed greater because they know that that money is going to be taken out and it's going to be used to kind of go into the government. And so this whole leakage of funds, and it was very interesting just hearing to them, and almost to the point, I think, for myself as I reflected, why would you want to keep doing this? There's this internal resiliency that they had, and a lot of them was just an intense desire to make things better. Despite all of the struggle and the challenges that they're experienced, but just to try to improve. That was just really mind-blowing to me to see. Another engagement that we had was actually with the Language Institute in the Congo, and so there's Americans there that were teaching Congolese how to speak English, and most of them were all the youth that were there. It was such a fun experience just to engage with them. But you can just see in their eyes, there's just hope, there's hope. And so, I think that for me, I needed that because after seeing just some of the challenges that the Congo, as you look around and you see the poverty, looking into their eyes and seeing that there is, they have faith that's going to get better. And I think it's very inspirational despite the circumstances that they have this perspective that to try to improve and to grow from where they're at. The other engagement that was just huge for me is, we have the opportunity to visit some of the military hospitals. And there's a couple of medics on this trip, me being one. So that was one of our requests because I wanted to see, okay, what is it like in the Congo and in Tanzania? How is their medical systems work? What does it look like? And that was very, very, I think probably more eye-opening for those that are not medical to see just the circumstances in which these medical hospitals are, particularly in the Congo. I mean, you're looking at, patients sitting outside for treatment and things of that nature, and facilities just not in place. And so that, I think, as a medic, kind of just had me thinking a lot about, how do we get to some sort of level of care that is, suitable for people within this environment? There's a lot. It still sits on my heart a bit, just kind of that experience and walking through that. But one of the things that was talked about during that visit in the Congo with the military hospital was they talked about how well they did during COVID. And one of the things they attribute that to is that, within Africa, there's lots of pandemics that they've experienced. And so they know how to do containment measures. They know how to do controlling of diseases. So it's interesting to hear what they did during COVID and kind of compare that to my experience here as well. So just to kind of close on comments, I think, a couple of things looking towards the future as far as what this trip provided for me was just a new respect for the African people and the complex challenges that they're facing. Again, you can read about it, you can see things on the news, but being there and being in the environment and actually seeing it, it brings it to a whole other level of understanding. The other thing is it had me rethinking quite a bit on U.S. policy in Africa, and does this policy and our strategic objectives, does that align with what Africans want? Because if you're looking at that and what U.S. wants to do, and certainly there's certain objectives, but if the African people have a different perspective of what is needed, there's going to be a struggle in trying to move either of those forward. The other thing was also the importance of institutions and governments. I think it's easy to complain about the U.S. and the bureaucracy and this or that we have to deal with. But Dr. Townsend, I will never complain about the IRS again. He gave us a good lecture of the importance of the IRS, and going to the Congo in particular, where you don't see these types of institutions to regulate stuff, to kind of hold people accountable, to move things forward. It's very drastic in comparing it to the U.S. when we look at that. And so that was another thing that I took. Also, just the warmth of the African people, from just sometimes the long, awkward handshakes that we would have to, the Tanzania military forces just kind of alongside us the entirety of the trip, going along with us everywhere. There's just a warmth about them and really a welcoming towards us that, you just never know when you go to other countries how the U.S. is received. And so I very much appreciated that. And just gained an incredible perspective. And, from that experience, I think it opened up a lot for me to hopefully go back and, do something there, hopefully on the medical side, since that's certainly my expertise, but just a phenomenal experience. And I'm thankful for the RSS process and the fact that we get to study and then go do some experiential learning. Because what you gain from this is it's nothing that folks can cover, and it's nothing that a teacher can teach you. So just very grateful for it, and just a phenomenal experience for me in East Africa. And so now I think I'm going to pass it along to Mark Kinstucky, who is on Dr. Kinstucky. Sorry, Dr. Kinstucky. I thought I was saying, okay, sorry, Dr. Kinstucky, who's going to go next. Thank you.
Hey, it is great to be back with the Alabama World Affairs Council. You remember me. So it is always an honor to teach at the Air War College. And this was a spectacular opportunity to go to two countries which are geographically on the front line of our great power competition with China and Russia, as well as cornerstones of anything that happens in the Indo-Pacific. So this was an amazing trip. We ended up completely circumnavigating the world. Lots and lots of airline points came out of this. These are two countries that are fascinating because of their relationships and history with the United States. The Philippines, of course, we were welcomed with open arms. They have an enormous fondness for the United States. They were a ferocious Second World War ally. They have never forgotten that. And yet, we saw signs of Chinese soft power and economic influence everywhere we went, including, splash on a bridge in Manila. India has a much more ambivalent relationship with the United States, part of that the baggage of a colonial legacy, but also a very deep, abiding Cold War relationship with the Soviet Union, which has continued with Putin's Russia, something that now has become an influential part of the conflict in Ukraine as Russia looks to evade sanctions and sell oil and do all sorts of things that the Modi government is interested in helping with. So this was a study in contrast. These are two enormous countries. Our travel was limited to some very small sectors because we couldn't even travel in country. Both of them would tell you that while we focus on great power competition, their number one focuses are things like counterterrorism and of course illicit financing countering. Kashmir didn't go away. India repeatedly told us Afghanistan is a booby trap we've left on their doorstep. They expect to have us back in 10 years to deal with that. The Philippines is still wrangling with Islamic extremism in Mindanao. I really appreciate our previous speaker bringing up that these are incredibly dynamic economies, lots of resources, very young population, growing very quickly, but it's one with a big, dark, informal economy. We found out firsthand that it's a tipping economy. Lots of things get done under the table. I was thrilled to pick up an anecdote that I'll be telling in Dirty Money for years. Let me say this correctly. We negotiated a host nation checkpoint by paying an expediting fee. We bribed a cop in Manila to get back to them. But both of these countries face extreme challenges. As we were told by the US Embassy in New Delhi, India has to produce 1 million new jobs a month to keep even with their growing population. As you'll be seeing, trying to keep up with the infrastructure, the water, the power, the sewer, the light, keeping the lights on is an enormous challenge. So all of this is exceptional as an experience for our students. Our students are why we do this. I was delighted to have 8 rock stars. All of them are going into jobs where this is hands-on, relevant, and applicable, and sends them out better than we got them. And so this is far better handled by my great student, Colonel Yoakley.
Thanks, Dr. Sankey, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to share a little bit about this trip with you. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Yoakley. I've served in the Air Force for 19 years, fly the A-10 Warthog, and I have a passion for the Pacific. I've served in Korea for 6 years, got to travel throughout the South Pacific with my family. Fortunate enough to go to the Pacific Air Forces after this for what I hope is another 3 years in the region, a real hardship tour. My wife's grandfather served in the Pacific under General MacArthur as part of his island leapfrogging campaign and returned to the Philippines. And my grandfather trained Chinese nationalist pilots during World War II and fought in the Korean War. So I'm excited to share my thoughts and experiences visiting 2 very important countries in the region. The Philippines, located within the first island chain, as we call it, offers necessary access into a highly contested region. India has a massive population, a credible military force, and has opportunities for US interests in a resource-constrained environment. I have just 4 slides with pictures that I hope capture my thoughts, and we'll first consider some impressions and attitudes with some historical context. I'd like to share some experiences with the people we met, and I'll share thoughts on vulnerabilities our group discovered. On the first slide, the picture on the left, if we could go back 1 slide, please, sir. The picture on the left is our group in front of Fort Santiago, which I think is a fascinating dynamic with the Philippines. As Dr. Sankey mentioned, Philippines was first colonized by the Spanish in the early 1500s, was taken by the US at the turn of the 20th century after the Spanish-American War, occupied by the Japanese, retaken by the US, and then eventually offered their independence in 1946. And these events were not exactly peaceful. But despite this past, 86% of the country embraces Catholicism. They maintain beautiful Spanish-inspired churches and architecture everywhere. Their native languages involve a lot of Spanish themes like "Cómo está?" And they still use what they call the Filipino peso as their original currency. Everyone speaks English, and 80s and 90s big hair band rock is a karaoke staple. They're really good at it. A common sentiment we heard through the Philippines was, we're quick to forgive. They know they're a developing country, and they know they need some help. They prefer that to come from the US. The second picture is us in front of Akshar Dam, a recently constructed Hindu temple completed in 2005. It was evident that the current party in power, the BJP and Prime Minister Modi, I'm going to stop for a second and caveat. These are my opinions and ideas, don't reflect the Air Force necessarily or the school. But apparent to me that the Prime Minister and the BJP are working hard to downplay the country's Mughal and Islamic past, promoting a Hindu narrative. This will become important in a moment. Beautiful Hindu shrines, though, some previously Muslim sites, many fairly new, really contrasted with the stark poverty beside them. Common sentiments and reminders in India, reminders of the US-Pakistan relationship. The fact that the Russians helped secure their northeast border, not the US. And the Indian, to paraphrase some military leaders, retired military leaders we met with, Indians have a long memory. Slide, please. I think India sees the writing on the wall that their reliance on Russia for defense is unsustainable and they need some investment. It might have to come from the US. But I surmise that they think we need them even more, which leads to their insistence on a make in India and give us your intellectual property attitude. These sentiments were reflected in the people we met. In the Philippines, we met with the Philippine Air Force, some industry leaders, all very welcoming, but also refreshingly blunt about US, China, and their own government. They criticized the US for not acting against Assad after his regime crossed the chemical weapon red line that we said we wouldn't stand for, and the way in which we pulled out of Afghanistan. And closer to their own home, for the US not supporting the Philippines during Scarborough Shoal incident in 2012. That said, everyone seemed eager to sit down and talk and have constructive two-way conversations about security concerns and ways to improve US-Filipino relations, a desire for more alignment and to fix some of their vulnerabilities. In India, we were unable to secure any meetings with government or military officials, but we did meet with two think tanks, one academic and one military related, though the latter, I would argue, was more of a propaganda machine. Their retired military leaders defended relations with Russia and the continued purchase of Russian oil. In their words, if India doesn't buy it, China will, and that would be bad for everyone. They defended a huge income gap and wealth disparity within India, defended it with the idea of karma, which I'll get into in a moment. But the academic think tank was willing to speak a bit more openly, even criticized the BJP government to an extent, especially for the relatively extreme Hindu nationalist movement, and admitting that in some places, extrajudicial killings have become problematic. And I'm talking, someone being accused of consuming beef and taken out and hung. Slide, please. I'd like to shift slightly now and discuss some of the vulnerabilities we saw, because I think here is where we can find some clear opportunities for the US to improve relations with our strategic objectives in mind. The Philippines admits that they're poor, a developing nation, and their per capita income stands at $8,000 a year, compared to a US around $65,000. They're working hard to modernize. They need improved roads, bridges, power, telecommunications. This is leading to a lot of Chinese investment. Dr. Sankey mentioned seeing lots of construction projects and bridges with Chinese flags painted on the side of them. But there's also a lot of latent Chinese control. For example, the National Grid Power Company of the Philippines, this is a Filipino company in name, that manages the power transmission across the country. It is 40% owned by the State Grid Corporation of China. Now, this subcontractor is listed as a technical partner, but to me that means Chinese equipment, Chinese computers, Chinese internet connections, and a government report leaked in 2019 asserted that the PRC could turn off Filipino power with a single switch. In research after our trip, I discovered that there are similar dynamics in the telecommunications industry within the Philippines, where China Telecom holds a 40% stake in Filipino 5G networks. The Filipinos don't like this arrangement, but they can't afford US alternatives if we even offer them. India, on the other hand, wants to be treated as an equal partner with the US, despite having a per capita income of just $2,100 annually. Poverty is rampant. There are few social welfare programs thanks to a caste system and this belief in karma. And again, to paraphrase one of these retired generals, India doesn't have a wealth issue, a wealth disparity issue, because the poor people know that they were supposed to be poor because they weren't good enough in their previous life. I don't know how long that'll stand up. Further, there are gigantic population. Their population necessitates, as Dr. Sankey mentioned, the creation of 1 million jobs per month. I see evolving geopolitics as a potential opening of opportunities. Pakistan and China are growing close. Russia and China are growing close. And this might reach a point that allows the US to get in between India and Russia. India has a huge potential labor force, a huge market, 1.4 billion people, and a lot of natural resources. One of the largest lithium deposits was recently discovered in the Kashmir and Jammu region. Slide, please. To wrap this up, both countries have rich and colorful histories, whether they formally recognize them or not. India's massive population and mutual distrust of China has potential to supplement US resources in a resource-constrained environment. The Philippines is strategically located to give the US some much-needed access to a highly contested region. Oh, and by the way, they are one of only 5 treaty allies in the area. India doesn't trust China's rise and sees China as a potential existential threat. The Philippines doesn't trust China, but is compelled to accept some of their investment as the US isn't currently willing to do what they need. To paraphrase one Filipino officer, a solution might be, can we buy it now and pay later? I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy, for taking us to the last slide. So we are at the end of our presentations, but now we have time for about 15 or 20 minutes of questions and answers from our students and from our faculty. If you will, I'd like for our students to have the first opportunity to answer the questions. You can see all the names, or you can just refer to them by the location that they went to, or just by 1, 2, 3. But one thing that I would say, and we had our students kind of allude to it, is the neat thing about the Regional Security Studies program. We talk about the travel, but of course, before we travel, I think it was Adrian mentioned that, is that we take, and we have classroom learning, of course, beforehand. So it's about 45 hours worth of classroom learning, plus the study ahead of time. So you're looking at about 90 hours, at least 120 hours worth of reading before you travel, and then the in-class time. And then we go and do the experiential learning. And if any of you, of course, you can read about something, you can hear someone talk about something, but when you're there and you're smelling it, tasting it, feeling it, talking to the people in the region, that's what makes it real. And so that's what's so wonderful about it. This is an expensive program for the US taxpayers, but we feel like it helps our national security leaders that graduate from our program understand the regions, have an empathy for the people that live in those regions. And I hate to use a Chinese proverb, as we just said, the Chinese are the basic threat. But the Chinese proverb, we're talking about the crisis. A crisis is a danger or a threat mixed with an opportunity to look at, as we've heard in each one of these regions, there's a crisis happening in almost every region, sometimes from foes like Russia, or sometimes from overpopulation or economic issues, but there's also opportunities in each of the regions as well. So let's jump into the question and answer. What I'll do is I'll bring the microphone to you if that's okay. Oh, you've got one there. Okay.
We'll distribute the mic out here so there are questions.
Perfect.
We'll start here in the room. First hand in the back. You'll take what? Behind you there.
Thank you, Mark. Warren Sprinter, retired Air War College faculty. For the folks that went to the Philippines, the new Marcos government is now providing U.S. access to at least 4 and maybe 5 new but small facilities. It is not apparently providing access to Subic and Clark, the big projection platform. The question is this: what kind of a footprint and projection capability do those new 4 access areas, largely in Luzon, but also Palawan, provide for A, South China Sea problem, or B, a rescue of Taiwan?
Dice, can you handle that one?
Sir, thank you for the question. I can handle a little bit of it. Subic and Clark absolutely remain the biggest power projection capabilities out there. My experience in the region, while they may not be included in these new EDCA sites, as they're called, Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, for the new sites, we still use those facilities for a lot of large-scale exercises, one of the largest in the Philippines being Balakatan. So there is some ability to still use those 2 locations. I honestly can't speak to the capabilities of the new EDCA sites, but what this opens up is an opportunity for military and U.S. investment in the country. One of the selling points for these EDCA sites to the Philippine government, and especially the local governors, is that a U.S. presence there brings local jobs. When we need more capabilities on those, the runways, the airfields, or whatever the military site may be, we need someone to build it. And unlike the Chinese, we're not going to bring in all of our own workers. We're going to hire locals. If we had more of a permanent presence, we hire a lot of locals. I had at least 15 Koreans working for me as Korean nationals when I was a squadron commander in Korea, and the same would be true in a place like the Philippines. So there's some economic capabilities. Now, as far as handling the South China Sea problem, absolutely some access within that first island chain. We can put forces on the inside of the chain, on the west side of the Philippines, and don't need to find our way around them. We think China may very well use a whole lot of submarines that will block a lot of our access into the area. But if we can already be inside that island chain, that's going to help us out considerably. As far as a Taiwan scenario, well, sir, the Luzon Island, the northern tip, is just about 150 miles from Taiwan, which is a whole lot shorter than over 1,000 miles from Guam. So that's going to give us a lot of capability, a lot closer to the fight. I hope that answers your question, sir.
Oh no, that was the answer I want you to get.
He's worked his way to a B+ now. We'll see by the end of this if Dice has got things. Jeremy, do you have any questions online that you'd like to share?
Yes, we've I'll stop sharing a moment. In Africa, you've pointed to the contrast between Tanzania and Congo. We hear in the public media about the US Special Forces operations in Djibouti and so on against elements in Somalia. We hear about Tanzania being affected by that. In terms of civilian programs, we've heard about in the past efforts to assist West Africa against Ebola. And there was a remarkable program from the W. Bush administration against AIDS throughout Africa. That was really quite a surprise from that administration. So what other programs did you hear about throughout Africa that projected American influence and American aid, military or civilian, that you thought were particularly successful or interesting?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question. I'll attempt to answer some of it and then pass it over to Dr. Townsend for any additional comments. And so we did have the opportunity to see a few things. We did go to see some of the PEPFAR programs, and I got to see how that was implemented in some of the military facilities. So that was kind of neat from our perspective to see. One of the things that I know within Tanzania that the military defense force was really kind of wanting more of, I would say, is, you referenced, sir, about these violent extremist organizations within the region. That is a challenge within Tanzania from their perspective. They also want more, U.S. perspective and help in relation to that. We've just walked through what we have in the last years in Iraq and Afghanistan and have some experience with managing and kind of dealing with these organizations and trying to combat them. And so I kind of sense the desire for more of that, more, what's the right word, just correspondence in relation to that. I think they were going to do some projects with the U.S. to try to help understand things a little bit better. So that was one thing that I saw in particular. The other thing that was talked about a lot when we were in the Congo, really in a lot of the sessions that we had, was the conflict on the eastern part of the Congo. And kind of their perspective was, I think, good for us to gain in relation to that conflict. And so there are a lot of nonprofit kind of medical organizations that are operating that are U.S. funded. So, and Dr. Townsend, you can correct me, I don't know if it was USAID that was kind of funding some of those to help with just the challenges that they're experiencing there, from just the devastation to the deaths and things of that nature. So there's some projects that are going on there that we were able to understand a little bit from the embassy folks that were explaining to us. But Dr. Townsend, do you have anything that you would like to add as well?
Sure, thank you. I'll add a few things. So I'm glad that you asked about PEPFAR. So for those of you who may not be familiar with PEPFAR, PEPFAR is a program that began under President Bush and continues today. In my opinion, it is perhaps the single largest success story in U.S. foreign policy in the last 25 years. It is credited saving somewhere between 25 and 40 million African lives. PEPFAR is that effective. It has reduced the age rates in Eastern and Southern Africa down to really sustainable and manageable levels, which they would not have been there without PEPFAR. Outside of PEPFAR, something that we heard about on our trip and that I've heard about multiple times in Africa is state-level partnerships. So for those of you who are familiar with U.S. states like Alabama, Florida, Maryland, all 50 states have partnerships between the National Guard and nations around the world. And several of those are in Africa. So Kenya, for example, state partnership, I believe, is with Massachusetts. And that's where a lot of African militaries get a sustained level of training and interaction with the U.S. military. It's not through active duty forces, but through these state partnerships in the National Guard, because they have the same contacts over and over again. And so African militaries who have these state partnerships send people to the National Guards to train in the National Guard here. The U.S. sends people to African militaries to do training and exercises. And I cannot tell you the number of times I have heard African militaries ask for more of those. Not every African military has. In fact, only about 7 or 8, I think, African militaries have one. And they all want one, and they all want more of them because they see the value in that. So I think on the security side of things, that is a very big program that is very popular in Africa that I think could be a potential way for us to expand our security access and our security relationships with multiple African militaries, because it's a very, very desirable program. But the other thing I think we hear about regularly in Africa on these trips, and I've heard about personally over there, is with the youth bowls that's going on in Africa, there is a big, big desire for their high achieving youth to get high levels of education, things like engineering degrees and science degrees, and bring that expertise back to Africa to help them in their development process. And they want to do that in the U.S. They want to go to U.S. colleges. They want the U.S. Academic system and visa system to increase and allow more academic exchanges, more students to come over and study, because they see that as a big, big pathway going forward. And I will tell you that increasingly those students are turning to China to go to school in China because of the sheer number of people that China allows to do that is significantly more than us. So we are by far the preferred partner for academic exchanges and for students to come and study. However, there's just a much smaller number of students who come to the US versus going to China. Partially it's a cost aspect, partially it's a visa aspect. There's a lot of reasons why that, but that's something you really want on the development academic side. Yes, sir.
To those of you who went to the two countries next to Russia, what sense did you get from the leadership there of their feelings and relationship to Putin as to his stability, his honesty, all that there, his relationship with the oligarchs, and where things are going in Russia?
So what we heard consistently throughout the region was a distrust of the entire Russian system, not specific to Putin, but it was a recurring theme of, for example, Finland was under Russian control during the Russian Empire from 1809 to 1917. The three Baltic nations each became part of the Russian Empire in the 1700s, again until 1918, and then they all experienced a period of freedom. The Winter War between Finland and Russia began in 1939, ran for literally about 110 days. And the Russians or the Soviets rather at that time, were roundly defeated by the Finns. In contrast to that, the Baltic nations didn't put up a fight and were easily absorbed by the Soviet Union. So, they were more or less the spoils of war in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And so I think the lesson, it's less about what they do or don't think about Putin and more about what they think about the way that history has proceeded. And I think each of them, and we heard from a number of both government and civilian officials in Estonia, to take that example, look at how the Finns defended themselves, were able to successfully fight the Soviets to a standstill, more or less, and then retained their independence after the end of the Second World War. In contrast, the three Baltic nations were absorbed by the Soviet Union, became Soviet republics, and only gained their freedom in 1991. So I think for all of them, and I would include the Finns in this calculation, they don't really care who is sitting in the seat of power in the Kremlin. It's a distrust of the Russian system and just, the Russian imperialist bent, I guess, if you will. And I hope I've covered some of it, but Dr. Camersino?
I would say Mark is all the way up to an A already. If you don't mind, I'll turn around. So I would just echo that very briefly. I've heard this stated before that maybe our solution to this is some Russian general has a religious epiphany and puts a bullet in Putin's brain. But as satisfying as that might be, I remind you that when Lenin died, the Soviet Union continued. When Stalin died, the Soviet Union continued. How these regimes fall is critical. There's been a lot of academic work done on this. If he dies a natural death, there is no incentive to change. If he is removed, as Khrushchev was, by an inner circle, there may be some changes, but the nature of the regime itself will not change. And to echo what Mark said, this deep sense of fear and loathing and mistrust, when I first took a group to the Baltic republics in 2009, when we couldn't visit Russia that year because we had put those half-baked sanctions that didn't last but a few months after they invaded the Republic of Georgia, the Lithuanian Minister of Defense that met with my group, after literally looking at each one of us in the eye, said, "We told you so." Russia doesn't change. And then the next year we didn't go back because we were going back to Russia. Their view was they had been telling us and telling us and telling us. We didn't hear it. We wanted to view the world as we saw it. As I mentioned in my comments, NATO was downsizing its military. We weren't going to need it anymore. But Putin is as much a symptom of the strategic culture in Russia, this imperial culture that has yet to abate, as the cause. And so we might get rid of Putin, and who knows what we'll get. And we heard that repeatedly. So back to the key takeaway for us was telling us that we may have gained 5 or 10 years is immaterial when 5 or 10 years from now, your country still sits on Russia's border. And that as Americans, we were constantly reminded of the geography, the closeness, and the fact that they have experienced it. And it's not as simple as Putin not waking up tomorrow because he got too much arsenic in his tapioca tonight. So,
Jeremy, do you have any questions online?
Yes, following on from that comment by Dr. Conversino, the 24 liberal democracies around the world in the last 20 years have had a resurgence of nationalism. Many other countries that are not liberal democracies have had resurgences of nationalism. What evidence have you found from the 3 regions? Nationalism is making relationships more difficult for the US.
And I want to pass it more. Perfect. Yeah. So Mr. Turner has some very specific views on this. He had mentioned the Russian minorities here. So I'll make one point. Nationalism has assumed this kind of bad odor in the United States. It usually comes with a modifier, right? And we're not talking about the kind of rabid fascistic nationalism that you see in Russia. But I would argue without nationalism, Ukraine would not have resisted. And this goes to the issue that Mr. Turner touched on, this will to defend. It's not enough to defend against something, but they are very careful. We are also defending something of value, something we want. Without that, our assumption and Russia's assumption was the Ukrainians were little Russians in waiting, that they would either give in or just accept their fate. And in Finland and Estonia, we were reminded it's not merely enough to gin up fear, but what is it we're defending? And I think as Americans, we should be stunned when over 1/3 of our population says they're going to get the hell out. And barely half is willing to defend. But in Finland, every year on year, they're ranked #1 in the world when asked if you have to take up arms in defense of your country with the outcome in doubt, will you fight? And they say yes, because they're defending something, not simply defending against something. And that's nationalism in the broadest sense, in the best sense. So,
yeah, this was something I actually wrote. Each one of us had to do a final RSS paper, and I actually wrote my RSS final about nationalism in Estonia, because this is something that you hear a significant discussion about in the region. So in Estonia, for example, at the end of the Soviet Union, the beginning of Estonian independence, you more or less had a choice if you were an ethnic Russian. You could return to the Russian motherland or you could stay where you were. But in Estonia specifically, if you stayed and you were Russian and you did not make any effort to integrate yourself into Estonian society, really by which I mean learn the language, you were what was considered a non-citizen Estonian. You have a gray passport. It allows you access to the EU. At the same time, it allows you free access to Russia. And so at the time of independence, I believe, and I should have probably written these numbers down, I think the number was about 315,000 of these non-citizen Estonians with a gray alien passport. it has become over the years a significantly less angst-ridden issue, if you will. We heard several times it referred to as kind of a dying issue because these were the generation that were already adults at the beginning of independence in 1991. And, you know, over the course of time, those folks would pass on to the next generation who mostly saw a lot of value in being Estonian and being a member of and belonging to the European Union. And so now I think that number has gone from about 315,000 to about 76,000. So now non-citizen Estonians make up about 6% of the population of that country. Interestingly enough, and I did reference the Quinnipiac University poll, if I'm saying that properly, it was also done along party lines, and I'm not making a judgment one way or the other, but I will say this, and I found it pretty shocking. More non-citizen Estonians are willing to pick up arms and defend the country of which they are not a citizen than self-declared Democratic Party members of citizens of the United States are willing to do the same in the US. So that's just an example both of, I think, the strength of nationalism, where you really do look at your neighbor as, you know, he is Estonian and he is Russian, but then also the changing nature, I think, of that in the Baltic region.
So I'll add a little bit to that. So nationalism is a very broad concept, a very broad term to encompass a lot of different phenomena. So there are different types of nationalism. So nationalism can be used to exclude people, to define people as being other than what we are. And that's often a negative thing. However, nationalism can also be used to define and unite people as being one identity, one group of people. And that can often be a good thing. And that's what Dr. Carpacino was talking about. So we've seen, I think, one of Africa's biggest problems in the last 30 or 40 years is actually a lack of nationalism. That their social identities, the ones that the conflict that happens in a lot of African states is along tribal lines, because they view themselves along tribal lines as opposed to being Kenyan, right? Being Kenyan is an identity that's less important in people's lives than being Maasai or being something else. And so we have seen in some places in Africa a rise of nationalism that's been a very good uniting thing of identifying people more and more as being part of a particular nation state. And it turns out that if you look at survey data, if you look at data of the countries in Africa that have a stronger nationalistic view, a nationalistic identity, tend to be the more successful countries in Africa, the ones that are developing faster, growing their economy, being more united, and having a less political conflict, less civil war style engagement. So it's important to think that nationalism as a uniting factor can be a very, very good thing for a state, and nationalism that creates this other identity out there as being somebody else can be very negative. So it's a broad concept.
We are at 7:30 now, and I think we're at the end of our time. Would you like for us to go ahead and end at this point?
One more question.
How about let's do one more question in house? One more question, anyone? Yes, sir.
It's maybe an observation more than a question, but for all three of the regions, talking about, you know, the tipping, the pseudo dirty money, and being a child of the 60s, when in civics class we all read a book called The Ugly American, and also grew up with the original Star Trek, The Prime Directive. I'm curious how much of our perceptions are based on measuring others through a Western American lens. And kind of as a challenge for next year, I would almost like to see a separate session and have our international officers come here and talk about their impressions of the cultures that they see in the United States and how We cannot understand how you have this because in my country, we do things this way. Of course, you pay the policeman for that because it makes things so much more efficient. You have to go down to a courthouse to pay for a speeding ticket. What a waste of time is that? So that's, like I said, maybe it's not a clear question, but I wonder sometimes how much we apply our own lens and don't understand from their perspective that corruption is what we call corruption is a cultural efficiency.
One man's bribe is another man's tip is another person's parking meter. In fact, my parking meter is almost out.
I wanted to just say something really quick in addressing that statement / question. One of the really great things, and it's already been alluded to today, that has happened over the course of this last year is that we have all had international fellows in our classes. And so in my class, when we're talking about the very, very difficult issues of China and Russia and Africa and the Middle East, I had a student from Taiwan, a student from Poland, and a student from Tunisia in my seminar group. And so it was a fantastic opportunity to sit down with each of those folks at different times, talking about different topics and talking about their views of and exposure to the United States and just kind of exchanging thoughts and ideas about that. So I certainly take your point, and it's really a good feature, I think, of our War College.
Adrian or Yoakley or Dex, do you have anything?
I think for me, there was a lot of self-reflection post RSS trip in relation to that. Coming out of the trip, you start to think, you start to see their perspective, and then you start to be in their environment and you understand why they do it, right? In a way, they're like, even though it may not make sense when you see it, there's an understanding and an empathy for the reason for doing certain things. And so it did require a bit of like a lot of asking questions, which I was thankful for. Most of the individuals that we talked with in the Congo and Tanzania were very open when we'd ask these questions. So tell us why this works this way. And that was helpful to gain that perspective. But because you go in with the mindset of like, this is the US and the US is right? And sometimes, when you're actually, I think, like I said, being there and seeing it and talking with people, there's a whole other perspective that you gain, and it drives a lot of self-reflection. And I think I'm still self-reflecting from that trip and kind of trying to rethink some thought processes that I had prior that probably may not be the best way to think about things.
Thanks. I concur with your sentiment. A lot of self-reflection after this. After just talking with our international students and visiting these countries, I've had the pleasure of visiting several other countries even before here, and you learn to appreciate the differences of these cultures. I think some of our blindness to other cultures is part of why we ended up where we did today with China. For a long time, we thought China was going to rise peacefully and at some point accept these democratic values if we introduced them to capitalism, and it didn't really work out that way. I have a hard time also, though, admitting, or I guess saying that we're ugly Americans. I think we have great ideals that might need to be tweaked from time to time when we look at different countries, but there are some underlying principles that I'm not necessarily willing to waver from. I think bribing cops is one thing, okay, but when we talk about corruption reaching the highest levels of government in the People's Republic of China, the CCP being able to come in with bags of cash to buy off political leaders in order to put their infrastructure into a country and compromise eventually that country's sovereignty, that's a whole different level of corruption. I have to struggle, I think, with the caste system that I witnessed in India. I'm a Christian. I have a hard time accepting that the poor are just supposed to be poor and they should accept that and maybe do better in the next life. I have a hard time accepting that, but requires some reflection. Those are my thoughts. I don't know where else to go. Thank you, sir.
So if I could now, as the chief academic officer, first of all, you see why the faculty is motivated to do what we do. Be able to work with men and women of this caliber every day, that despite the rank jackassery in Washington, at this level, we're in good hands. But before I turn over to the president, so first of all, thank you all there. This is a very busy week for them. They hosted the National Security Forum for them to take another evening out of their time to spend with us on behalf of your university. I greatly appreciate that. The same to my colleagues from the faculty. I'll leave you with one thought, though, real germane to this last question. And it's from a man I rarely agree with, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. And I mentioned this at War College the other day. If we want to get a better view, you heard some of this, on how the world often looks at us, he said, if the war in Ukraine is keeping you awake at night, then just imagine it's happening in Asia or in Africa, and it won't bother you so much. And at some level, if you ask the Indian foreign minister, he may have a point. So big smiles, everyone. Thank you, and I'll turn it back to you.
Let me just echo Dr. Conversino's thanks to the faculty and to the students for giving us your insights, for spending your time with us on what I know is a very busy week. We all benefit from this, and we appreciate, just as you went out into the world, that you would go out into the community and come to us. And I think that was a great idea about bringing international students in. We'll look to see if we can do something like that. What an incredible resource we have here in the river region to be here with Air University and with great people. Thank you all. Thank you to our members for coming and participating and for the questions, both here and virtually. Thank you to the faculty and staff. We're looking forward to another good year at the Alabama World Affairs Council next year. So stand by, stay tuned, and we'll be in touch about the program. Thank you. Have a good evening.